It sounded weird, it vibrated harshly, and it was not even that pleasing to drive. French journalists did not really like it, owners considered it unreliable, everybody disliked the PRV. On the other hand, it was lightweight, quite advanced, and decently powerful. Why did they hate such a great engine? It was in the middle of the 1960s, and French executives were talking about possible cooperation between a Peugeot and a Renault company. The result was a joint subsidiary located in the town of Douvrin. It was created in 1969 under a name of Française de Mécanique, and by then it was not even decided what would be manufactured in the factory. At the time, Volvo attempted to create a big engine to fit into the automobile portfolio, but eventually left the efforts and came to an agreement with the Peugeot Renault company, each of them owning the same portion of the shares. Each of the partners sold a premium, large and powerful engine. That's easier said than done, as it was required to fulfill several objectives. It was meant to be both longitudinally and transversely mounted in both front and rear engine bays, and for various kinds of use. There are literally dozens of models using it, from large family and executive cars, through vans, up to powerful performance models, including race cars. The work began in 1971, and a V8 was determined as the best possible compromise for everybody's needs. Little did they know what troubles and obstacles would appear on the way. The engine debuted in 1974, but as we all know, it turned out as a 6-cylinder. The decision to cut off 2 cylinders was made at the last moment. The most evident trace after the V8 development, the bank angle, remained. A 1976 documentation of the PRV engine does not mention an 8-cylinder as a base idea, though there is a V8 concept in a Douvrin museum, and it allegedly was meant to be a modular power plant. The original thought was to build a large capacity power plant for luxury European automobiles, and the development began with the V8. There were a number of reasons why the 8-cylinder got the short end of the stick. One of them was the 1973 oil crisis, with gas prices skyrocketing. Then there was the tax burden on engines about 2.8 liter, heavily penalizing any larger motors. And then it was Renault that voiced their complaints. They planned to install the PRV into a longitudinally oriented front-wheel drive layout of a new Renault 30, and they asked for the 6-cylinder. During development, emphasis was put on compactness, not only in terms of length, but also in the height and overall packaging of its accessories. The 90-degree angle of the banks worked well for this purpose, even though it is not perfect for a V6, as it is for a V8. Regardless, vibrations were much smoother compared to a 4-cylinder, and with its cast aluminum design, tipping the scale at 156 kilos, it was acceptable even for the more front-heavy Renault 30. The engine used wet iron liners and, interestingly, also iron crankshaft caps weighing only 27 kilos as a short block without internals. The engine featured an over-squared ratio of the cylinders, 88/73, forged connecting rods, and a 12-valve setup with a single cam bank. The camshafts were chain-driven, which was not as common in the 1970s. Though there were non-split 120-degree spaced rod journals on the cast iron crankshaft, and that produced a distinct, uneven sound. It required a heavy flywheel for a vibration reduction, and thus was deemed lazy in the upper rev range. Volvo had the honor to introduce this engine in their 264, fed by the Bosch K-Jetronic. Swedes named it AB27E, with a displacement of 2664 cc and a power of 140 horsepower. It was quickly followed by the Peugeot 504, 604, and also the aforementioned Renault 30. The first French models used a different version fueled by a pair of Solex carburetors, a single barrel for the low end and a 2-barrel for the high RPM thrust, making 135 horsepower. Often these are swapped for less troublesome carbs, but back in time, neither with carburation nor fuel injection has this ever been a fuel-efficient engine. In 1976, surprisingly Porsche was looking at the PRV and managed to install it into a test mule based on a 924 platform. While it worked perfectly fine, Porsche withdrew as they were unhappy with the fuel economy and refinement. Unfortunately, neither of them was up to Porsche standards. In 1977, the very first Alpine received the PRV unit. It was the A310 with a carbureted 150 horsepower version, and that significantly boosted sales of the model. Until 1980, not much happened with the engine. The most powerful variant of the 2.7 liter got into a 1980 Talbot Agora, boasting triple Webers and the status of the fastest French four-door automobile. At the beginning of the 80s, Volvo introduced a 2.8 liter variant by boring out cylinders by 3 mm. The power output climbed to 155 horsepower, but for some reason, this version suffered from premature cam wear. The problem was addressed in its successor, the B280. Many people argue that the PRV was underpowered, but a BMW M30 was making about 170 horsepower from roughly the same displacement, and a 2.5 liter Buso was right there at 158 horsepower at the beginning of its journey. As we mentioned earlier, major things were announced by the French in 1984. Most importantly, the shared crankshaft pins were now offset by 30 degrees, making it an even-firing 90-degree V6. Moreover, Renault came up with forced induction. It appeared in a Renault 25 V6 Turbo with a 2.5 liter unit, and it would use the 91mm bore and a low stroke of 63mm. The engine was equipped with Rendix fuel injection, electronic ignition, Garrett turbocharger, and an intercooler. Using 0.7 bar of boost, the peak power raised to 182 horsepower. This powerplant was basically shared with the newly developed Renault Alpine GTA since 1984. Tested in the 740 and 760, Volvo attempted to develop their turbocharged model as well, meant for the 780 Bertone. However, in its small engine bay, it tended to overheat, and the idea was scrapped in favor of a B280F version. The 1990 year was the last one Volvo participated in the development and changed over to a new modular inline series. However, during the same time, Renault increased the power of the 2.5 liter to over 200 horsepower by turning up the boost to 1 bar in the 25 and the Alpine GTA. Besides, a new naturally aspirated version was launched, displacing 2,849cc. It had a 10mm longer stroke compared to the 2.5 liter. Using a Bosch LH Jetronic system, its power output varied between 129 to 194 horsepower. Some models did use carbureted 2.9 liter, for instance a 160 horsepower Alpine V6 GT or an outgoing 193 horsepower Alpine A310. While Renault turbocharged the PRV, Peugeot created 24-valve single-cam heads for it. Each intake valve had its rocker arm, however the two exhaust valves per cylinder shared a single rocker. The engine displacement was 2,975cc with a 73mm stroke. This design was unique to the Peugeot 605 and Citroën XM engines and was not shared with Renault. Besides, there was a complicated intake manifold with several flaps opening and closing according to load and RPM to increase the breathing ability of the engine. On the other hand, with a slightly lower stroke of 72.7mm, Renault came up with a different but yet even more interesting solution for the 3 liter. Twin turbo. It was somehow similar to the single-turbo Alpine A610 with a Garrett T3. The Safran biturbo, as it was called, used two KKK KO4 turbos, forcing up to 0.55 bar of air inside, and was engineered with the help of companies like Irmscher and Hartge. The power and torque were only up by 5%, but it featured an all-wheel drive system and additional turbo cooling pump, which was able to run up to 12 minutes after shutdown. As mentioned, Volvo withdrew from the project in 1990. However, the French continued up until 1998 in models like the Renault Laguna, Safran, Espace, and a Citroën XM. The XM was a successor of a Citroën SM, which used a different Citroën-developed 90-degree V6 shared with Maserati. There were some special applications of the PRV, most notably the DMC DeLorean, but also Venturi, mainly using turbocharged versions of the 2.8 and 3-liter PRV. Interestingly, the engine was used as a base for a later Alfa Romeo 155 DTM V6 model, as the 90-degree angle provided more space for an adequate intake system. Besides, the PRV was also deployed in endurance racing, as Peugeot allowed a group of engineers to develop a twin-turbo engine for the WM-P88. It was the only bi-turbo 24-valve PRV to be used, and it achieved a power output about 900 horsepower. The car was incapable of competitive racing, but after those attempts, a single target was set: to break the 400 km/h barrier. During the 80s, the Mulsanne straight was a real straight without chicanes, and the P88 managed to be speed-trapped at 405 km/h. Thereafter, since 1990, the chicanes were added on the 6-km-long straight, and the record might not ever be broken. The PRV was built in over 970,000 examples, which is a huge production number. It powered dozens of cars of various brands, and had to fulfill needs as a fuel-efficient luxury engine, but at the same time to be an interesting sporty power plant. Thierry Astier, a deceased French automotive journalist, voiced his opinion about the PRV at driven2write.com, that it unfairly received an awful reputation in France, mostly because of the rough run, thirstiness, and unwillingness at high revs. The engine was said to be immensely strong, reliable, infinitely tunable, and quite compact, allegedly able to achieve the 900 horsepower output on the stock engine block. From the factory, it was also fairly lightweight, and the power-to-weight ratio was something that caught the attention of a few plane makers. It only needed bigger and sooner investment to become one of the very best six-cylinder of its era.